everyone, and welcome to Utility Safety In Depth, where we take a deeper dive into topics recently covered in Incident Prevention magazine. I'm Kate Wade, the editor of Incident Prevention, and your host for this podcast. In this episode, I sit down with Cheryl Richardson, the president of New York-based contractor H. Richardson & Sons, and Bill Martin, the president and CEO of Think Tank Project LLC. Cheryl recently wrote a feature article for the April-May issue of Incident Prevention magazine titled An Experiment in Crew Member Engagement, which discusses a new safety initiative Bill has introduced at Cheryl's company. So without further ado, I want to welcome Cheryl and Bill to the show. Good morning, you two.
Good morning, Kate. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Morning.
Bill, are you out there?
I am. Morning.
So thanks to both of you for being on here. I think this project that you have been working on together is really interesting. So Cheryl, I think you have a really interesting backstory. Can you tell us more about your background and how you came to assume the role of president of H. Richardson & Sons?
Sure, Kate. I'd love to. So my background, we're going to notice as we go through, doesn't include really anything in the utility business. I started out at Target stores. Actually, I was hired in when I was in high school as a fitting room attendant, and I moved up to a store manager, opening a new store over a period of about 8 years. At Target, I think, any business, even though you're not in the business that I ended up in here, I think in any business you learn a lot of things. And I think about Target, a lot of customer service, a lot of reinforcement and training on customer service. And also, as anyone in retail knows, you have to hone your multitasking skills or you cannot make it. So those are the things I learned there. I also drove a forklift at a John Deere plant overnight when I was on the third shift when I was working at Target. So I had a little bit exposure to the construction sort of personality during that time. So after I left Target, I purchased a bar and a restaurant. It was actually a nightclub with outdoor concerts. And that was the first time I had come into a business that I had not worked my way up through. I had no restaurant or bar experience in that business. So I think that was the point where I really had to collaborate and to learn to trust people and get information so that I could run that business successfully. I did that for about 3 years. I moved to the North Country up on the St. Lawrence in New York State. And I started out there as a bank teller, moved up to being a mortgage loan officer, obviously a lot of finance there. So I had picked up a lot of finance during that time. And more recently, actually the last 20 years, I managed a surgical practice. And I started out as the one employee, one surgeon, one location, and we built up to 7 providers and 4 locations. So a lot of pride, and I was very involved in that building process. But the one thing I would say about the surgical practice, and I don't want to put anyone on the defense here, but the surgical personality is very much like the lineman personality in that they have very precise skills. They're doing a job that 99.9% of the population cannot do. So they become somewhat self-centered, maybe a little diva-like, that sort of thing. I was fortunate, and this is going to sound strange, but I was fortunate to work in a surgical practice where there was a lot of dysfunction. The directing physician didn't understand communication or managing, so there was a lot of shame and blame and being embarrassed and never knowing what you're going to walk into in the morning. So when I came into this job with the linemen, and I know a lot of people come into this industry and they're very shocked by the type A personality and the self-centered sort of personality that they have to do their job. For me, it was very refreshing. There was no dysfunction. Now I have type A's who are a little bit self-centered, but there's no dysfunction. So for me, it was refreshing. I had no problem dealing with these people. I would admit also, though, that my husband is a lineman or as retired from being a lineman. I have a brother-in-law, a son, a nephew who are linemen. So I understood that personality. I think in advance of coming in. When I came into this company, there was an office with a project manager and an office staff who were handling everything, and there had been some issues there. So I made the decision, I'm not going to say this is the right or wrong, to let all those people go. There were a lot of finance issues and that type of thing, and rebuilt that office in terms of estimating and invoicing and finance and all those things. And that time, I would never ever say was an easy time for me. It was very difficult. I had a lot of migraines, lost a lot of sleep, just a very vulnerable time for me, I would say. But at the end, I guess when we talk about my history, there are positives and negatives to not starting out in this industry and growing up through it, because I think it gave me a whole different view of some of the practices we do, safety especially, and also just I've always valued respect, trust, and transparency while holding people accountable. And I think that's something that maybe I brought into this industry and people just took it and ran with it. So It worked out well for us, my lack of experience.
Very nice. Well, so can you explain what led to reaching out to Bill? Like, what kind of things were happening on the job and in the field that indicated changes were needed? And can you also talk a little bit about how you even heard about the work that he's been doing?
Sure. In terms of the safety program when I started, I'm going to be honest, we really didn't have one. We had put together a safety manual. The person before me was bringing a chiropractor in to be our safety man, and I knew that wasn't right. I knew we had to have someone who'd gone through the apprentice program, done the work, had the respect of the men, and could go out and actually know what they were looking for out there. So the first thing we did was we did hire a safety person for the field, created the checklist. We also started having safety meetings once a week. And I'm going to be honest with you, those meetings were print something off the internet, email it to the general foreman. And we know what happens at those meetings because I have little spies like my husband who be in the show-ups. So, they hand the paper to the apprentice, the lowest apprentice. He has to read it. People are loading their trucks, talking to their wives on the phone. It was what I would call the illusion of safety. We were checking boxes, but we weren't really protecting anyone there. I don't think. So one thing that we do now that I love, this came from my son was an apprentice working for a contractor. And I wish I knew the name because I love this practice, but my son came to me and said, once a week, I think it was every Wednesday morning, this contractor has a message from the owner and everyone dials in and they hear what the owner has to say. And it can be anything that's happening in the company. It can be like we recently made the Eclipse Day a holiday, so no one had to come to work that day and get out. So it would be that sort of just general information. And at that point in time, I thought about that. I thought, if we could do a message from the owner and then a safety message behind that, everyone will get the same message. It isn't some people listening, some people not, or some people taking things differently. So we started that about 2 years ago, and that's worked out really well. We're still doing that. We have got that message down to, I do about 4 minutes and the safety man does about 4 minutes. So the guys aren't languishing on the call or ready to hang up because they've heard enough. We make it very short and sweet and to the point. And so we're still doing that. I think that, the other thing is that we certainly observe stand downs in that type of thing and the whole retraining, but I was never, ever, ever comfortable with the fact that it looked like a reactive process and not a proactive process. And I don't have Bill's knowledge of the line side, the medical side, and I knew there was something missing, but I didn't know what, and there was no way I was going to come up with that. So what ended up happening was Kevin Charleston, who works for us as a safety person, he sent me one of your podcasts, and it was Actionable Safety. And you guys covered so much in that podcast in terms of psychological safety and the steps in Tim Clark's books. I think the thing that grabbed me there was when you walk into this organization and you see this whole stop work authority and the whole see something, say something, and then you watch apprentices being treated like slaves at the end of the day or being screamed at on the job, you realize that it's another illusion. Those guys aren't going to speak up. And I understood that. And that's where that really resonated with me with that podcast, because it was talking about creating an environment where people could actually speak up and we could change safety, in ways that were very intangible. So at that point, the other thing that I learned on that podcast at the very beginning was that Bill was working for a different contractor. So I was like, oh, I can't do anything with this guy. But it turned out by the time I heard the podcast, he had retired or moved on or something like that. So we reached out to him at that point.
Very nice. It was almost fortuitous that way, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Bill, I want to talk to you for a second about how you came up with the ideas that you're working to implement at H. Richardson. Can you talk about a little bit about what you're doing there and also how you came up with these ideas or this formula?
Sure. So Cheryl has helped me, and I'm going to try to be concise because she's helping me try to learn how to be more concise, right? Because I could spend an entire podcast just telling you about all the things that led up to that. But the having been a lineman for 20 years, I had already experienced the flavor of the month that shows up, from not to be disrespectful to the utilities, or it's just a matter of fact. An initiative will show up and they'll dump it on the crews, and this is what you're doing now. And then we might sit through 6 hours of human performance training, and then we go to work, and work never looked any different to me after those meetings. It just seemed to be the same. So I started researching what change looks like and what influences humans, as not so much I mean, there's lots of really good information out there. Human performance is really good. The HOT principles, the hierarchy of controls, all of those things are really good. The James Reason's Swiss cheese model, they're all based on really good ideas. But as Cheryl was saying, the surgeons and the linemen and the utility workers speak their own language. And unless we translate those great ideas to something in their language, they can't learn to value it, or they can't apply it. It doesn't translate. So we've mined what we have now. It's the statistics in 11 years haven't changed at all. So what led up to it was trying to find what will change the environment that will help the linemen engage more, become more synchronous, so that the result of the environment makes them safer. That make any sense?
Makes tons of sense to me.
Seemed to make sense to Cheryl too, because that's why I ended up there.
Well, so I want to throw out a question for the both of you. And can you both take turns discussing the implementation of this initiative? What exactly has happened in the field? How did you guys implement this? And then, I want to get some responses about the feedback too, both from workers and from your perspective.
So from my perspective, I know that implementation or training or any of those beginning processes are so important. When the first time I met Bill, he actually brought some of his props in with him, and he did a little mini training with me with seeing the cow and those sorts of things. And as he talked, I realized that this wasn't something that we could just put him in the field and start to explain these things. These guys needed to have some exposure to this ahead of time, and they needed to understand a little bit about the human brain and how he's bringing science into safety and that type of thing. So we scheduled 3-hour meetings at the hall for everyone in the company. We have a fiber division, a forestry division. Everyone came to these meetings. 3 hours was plenty. I'm going to tell you that, because I really think that when you go beyond that with people who work with their hands in the field, it's torture and you just lose them. So the 3-hour period was the hardest part was keeping Bill down to 3 hours. That worked really well. I think people, first of all, Bill is very interactional. So people weren't looking down and they were paying attention. And so we had comments after that. And Bill, I'm just going to steal your show here. Bill wanted to pass out a 15-page or 15-item comment form. And I said, Bill, they're not going to do anything with that. So he cleverly passed out a 3-item. They had 3 items to comment on. And we had some really good comments. Some people said that was the best safety training they ever had. So that was a positive. The next thing we did, and we wanted to do that right behind that, but I believe we had a couple of storms. So there was probably a 5-week period that we didn't get Bill out into the field. But Bill and Steve Martin, our safety supervisor, went out in the field and practiced with each crew what we call the roles of concern. So after they had finished their tailboard, Steve and Bill got them in a circle, and they all talked about their role, kind of hopefully syncing with eye contact and that kind of thing, talked about their role and any concerns that could happen that day. And I know there was an incident, Bill, I believe in Dansville, where the guys were looking around, talking about their concerns for the day. And I think one person had noticed a cross arm down the line that was a little bit damaged. And just looking at that caused the crew to look and realize there was going to be a guy wire in the way when they went to transfer things. So the whole idea there was really just to have a diversity of opinions, having people bring things up, which would cascade into other people or trigger other people to bring other things up, and the meeting of the minds, basically. Yeah, that was the way we implemented it. We did a second visit with Bill, and that was mental rehearsals. And I know that you guys have talked about that, where the guys are basically practicing what happens if they have an emergency or a man down. And the whole idea there is, I think it's called maybe mental muscle. But if you actually do it, or it isn't narrated to you and said, hey, first you call 911, go look for the AED. If you actually have to do it and say it, it's going to stick in your mind much better. And I know that Bill already knew this, but they do it the first time and they're very awkward, and the second time much better, and by the third time they're pretty much experts at knowing what to do. So that was Bill's second field visit. I believe, Bill, also you reinforced the whole rows of concern things that visit. So that's kind of how we started the program.
Yeah, Bill, do you want to take a turn at this?
Well, I mean, she did such a good job. I don't know if I could do better, but I want to expand a little bit on the questionnaire. So I had a questionnaire that I would hand out, and when Cheryl saw it, she said, "Yeah, this isn't going to work." So I sent her a 3-question questionnaire. 2 questions were check the box, yes, no, with a slight response. And the third question was space for a paragraph of an answer. And she sent me back an email. She says, are you being sarcastic? Did I offend you? and I laughed. I said, no. I said, if it came to your mind, you're 100% right. I said, this is a result of what you told me, right? And I've since used that. I actually did 6 workshops for National Grid in Long Island, and I used the same form. And they would the manager would run up after each workshop to read all the comments. And they said they never comment on anything, you know? And I think what Cheryl released in me was creating a space where people can comment. And then also during the workshops, making sure that the 4 words that they're not workers are seldom asked when we spring a new initiative on them is, what do they think? So the whole concept behind this model, it is not so much, I mean, the roles and concerns, the mental rehearsals, and then there's a third one that we may or may not talk about today, but is actually the model. The model is new. Basically, if we create an environment where the worker can test and evaluate our initiative, then they can give us feedback. And I think Cheryl got some feedback at some point from somebody. I think they might have even changed to job reform. I can remember, but that's not the model we're using. We're using a model of command and control. I'm in charge, and this is the new initiative, and this is what we'll do. And this one creates engagement, especially at the end of the job brief, right after you sign it, because of course that's the worst thing you could do on a job brief or for a brain, because it's the same. When you sign, you're done with it, just like when you sign for your dinner or the pair of jeans you just bought. So right after that, Steve and I worked to put them in a circle, and then that eye contact is important. There's a whole discussion on that too, but it synchronizes them, and that, I think that environment creates a better synchrony. And I like to mention, like an orchestra, you can tell really quickly when somebody in the orchestra is out of sync. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But or a football team, you know, if the quarterback is confused, it doesn't go well usually. So if the team starts to learn that they are a team and their synchrony is the most important thing, these exercises help them start to recognize when there's a disruption to that. And that's something we're not really working in this industry.
Well, you mentioned that model, and I just wanted to ask, I'm like, is that the same model that you're going to be talking about at the IP Utility Safety Conference in Orlando?
So I'm doing a workshop, pre-conference workshop on the formula for worker-centered safety. And that basically is similar to what I do for workshops I did for Cheryl. So can people understand the science behind it? Because it's all based on neuroscience and psychology. And it's the recent neuroscience, not 20 years old. So, but like I mentioned, once you understand that, then the model, every worker is already the market tester for all of their tools and all of their FR clothing. Anything we give them, they tell us if it's any good. And if it's any good, they value it, they use it. So the model is to create tactics that help steer the environment to make it safer, but at the same time, engage the workforce into interacting and testing these ideas. And I believe that's what Cheryl and Steve are going to talk about. I'm not exactly sure. They both have so much information. I just know that the world, it's going to be helpful for people to field questions to the CEO and the lead safety rep to talk about, both what was difficult and what they saw. And that's kind of where this came from. Does that make sense, Cheryl?
It does make sense. Yeah, it does, Bill. I think that, one thing about your program is, we talked about the fact that it's proactive and not reactive. And we've also talked about the fact that it's very hard to measure. If you are doing something that's going to prevent something and something doesn't happen, we don't notice it didn't happen, and we don't realize that. So I guess when you were talking about some of the things we actually have been able to measure, and there was a situation where some guys changed the job brief. Bill came back for his second visit and talked about the mental rehearsals and then the roles of concerns. And we had a JL and a working foreman and a general foreman were getting together afterwards saying, we like the roles of concerns, but we really think when guys sign that job brief, they're going to be done and not do that whole process. So they went through the job brief, and we hate to add to our job briefs because it's inversely proportional. You had so much stuff and now people pay less attention. So they found a couple of spots in the job brief that were no longer really practical to use, and they actually replaced that with people signing off with their roles and concerns. So hopefully that will kind of trigger people or cue them up to do that practice. The other thing about roles and concerns is that I think we've come into sort of a hybrid model of that. Sometimes the guys in the field don't like structure in terms of saying it's time for roles and concerns. So sometimes it's more like just saying, hey, let's stop right now. Let's look around. Do you guys see anything at all that could cause a problem today? That sort of thing. So I think different crews are using it differently in terms of how they're wording it, how they're kind of assimilating it with their, lineman language. But that I think we have to be a little bit relaxed on, and hopefully organically each different crew will end up, using it in a little bit different way.
Well, so can you tell me, Cheryl, a little bit more about how, I guess Cheryl and Bill, about how the implementation has been going from a field perspective? Like, what kind of feedback are you getting from workers? Are they happy with this? Do they talk about it? Do they want to continue, to do the initiatives?
So one thing that I have, two things that I'm really proud of that have happened, because as I said, it's very hard to measure. We had a situation with a lineman where his apprentice actually turned him into the general foreman for poor workmanship or for craftsmanship. So it had to be really bad, right? And then right after that happened, the same lineman wired a termination, and the splice team went out in the field and they looked at the termination and said, we're never going to use this. And in fact, I think it went to the hall and they used it for an example of how not to wire a termination. And so the working foreman, after these two things happened with this particular lineman, the working foreman called me and he said, hey, this happened with this guy, this happened with this guy, something bad's going to happen. We can predict this now because we've seen two things happen. They would not have used the word predict in the past. They would not have watched those things. So that I think was for me was really a big success. The other thing that happened was with a work log. I had to let fire, but I had to let a general foreman go. And the crew that he had a crew of about 10 guys. They were very close because they had been together for quite a long time. They had actually had a show up where they were able to camp near the show up. So they were really bonded. And I know that it hurt that crew for that man to leave. And when the guys fill out work logs every day, and when the work log came in the next day from the day that he had left, there was a note on there that said that one of the apprentices suggested that they stop working and sink and vent and talk about what had happened before they go back to work in order to work safely. So those were just a couple of examples of language that hadn't been used in the past that I feel like has been kind of spurred things on because of some of the things that Billy has said to people. Billy, do you have other feedback that you have known?
Well, having been on all of your sites, Cheryl, with the guys, I tell them that I've done the research and I know what the research shows, but it doesn't matter what I know. What matters is that they need to experience this and tell me what they think. And those 4 words, what do you think, seem to be pretty important. And in these discussions, I talk about how synchronizing is important, like a team. But the word prediction is a word that makes a lot of us uncomfortable. And I do some anecdotal research on that of my own regularly, to the annoyance of people that don't even know me when I just stop them randomly. And I ask them whether or not they can predict their future. When a group gets together and they share a concern, this is what I tell them, that concern is a prediction of an unwanted outcome. We don't mitigate any risk we don't predict will happen. We don't believe something will happen. We aren't going to mitigate that risk. So the bit larger the pool of concerns early on, just discussing that actually affects a subconscious level of our brain to be looking for that thing. So to hear Cheryl talk about hearing the words synchronize and prediction, that's a little bit different perspective. And it's also, prediction is proactive, right? We spend a lot of our time trying to prevent that incident from ever happening again. That's the back looking forward. Prediction is forward looking to the future. And if we want to move forward, we have to spend some of our time increasing that pool of predictions. So I don't have a lot of other examples other than I've been on the site almost every time. And so Steve Martin, just a little background. Steve has been in the outside construction utility industry for 22 years. I was a project manager for a company that he happened to be a bare hand specialist for, working high voltage. And he has over 7,500 hours of hot time, which is a lot. So he has a lot of experience. And when somebody like him sees something that clicks and makes sense to him, it's not hard for him to get engaged with this. And he tells me every time that this happens, when the group actually spends the time to bounce concerns off each other, they always find something that's not on the job. Because the difference between that is how when we interact like that, I can say, like I've done this with you, right, Kate? I could say finger licking, and you see the word good and a chicken, right? Well, the same thing happened. A guy with 20 years looks up and says, I'm a little worried about those porcelain potted cutouts. We're about to set a pole right there, and we better make sure they're not cracked. And then the other guy says, yeah, we're going to have a curly Mac stretching on that thing for raising that face up 6 feet. We better take a hard look at that, because if that's cracked, that's going to put pressure on it. His curly Mac came from that guy's porcelain potted cutout. But if we never had that discussion, they might have noticed that cutout, but at the last moment. And then that becomes a reaction, not a calculated response. So,
but I guess my next question is about what's next. I mean, you're doing this great work. It seems to be making an impact. Are there other phases of this initiative? Are there future plans for anything?
Well, I talked to Cheryl a little bit about this. So there's one of the things I told her as a consultant, I don't want to be a consultant that they're dependent on, because that means it's kind of like when the safety guy is making you safe. When he goes on vacation, you're screwed, right?
Well, he's like your training wheels, right? So at some point you got to take the training wheels off.
All right. So when I was a safety director, I used to tell my staff, ask them, so what are you doing to help them make themselves safer this week? Because that's not compliance. So Cheryl's in a position right now where if you're when you input something like this, it's really hard. You need to foster it somehow. And that's difficult, because in the middle of storms and traveling in and out of storms and dealing with the different utilities, that's kind of where we are. There is a third phase that came from the Japanese rail line. In Japan, they reduced incidents by 85% on their high-end rail line by using a thing called point and call, right? And linemen already do it, right, to some extent, when they're doing three-way communication. Hey, I have jumpers going on, and they use language, or they use three-way communication. But they found there that if they actually created a physical response to pointing and calling it out, and then expecting a return, it reduced calls. So once you've identified your concern, let's say you and I are working up on in a going to go to work, and the phases are close. So here's the deal. I'm going to point and shout when you get close to those phases. Say, hey, you're getting close to another phase. And that person's going to say, acknowledge, copy, close to that other phase. That creates a physical action that helps anchor that part of your brain even more. So real roles and concerns are a prediction of an unwanted outcome. Mental rehearsals are another prediction of the worst case scenario, and you figure out what your response to that's going to be. Because if I'm working with you, I don't want my response to be my first dry run. And that affects, there's a whole bunch of neuroscience in that, but I will talk about. Then the third, to me, is to continue moving with tie a physical action to this process, so that it becomes a huge awareness thing, right? Like we have a drop zone in this industry, and often you'll hear the guy going into the zone, expecting no response. And what we need to do is say, hey, I'm going to the drop zone, and he'd point, and somebody down there pointing back and say, I got you. You're going back and you're going in the drop zone. We create that type of communication. And like Cheryl said, we won't know what incidents we prevent, because we don't have any record of the things that don't happen. But that's, to me, those are three simple phases, all based on the same prediction, and but the third one, I think, requires a little more time, and for a company to try to see if they're able to adopt the model. Because if you spring too much too soon, it just becomes chaos. And right now, I maybe I'm wrong, Cheryl, you can pitch in on this, but I think you're in the process. I mean, you've got to really, I've visited your culture, your company. I've seen a lot of companies and been a lineman for a long time and traveled to a lot of storms. And Cheryl's model of how she set her company up, it puts a lot of responsibility on Cheryl, but what she does is she empowers her general foreman gives them the authority to make the decisions. And that way she doesn't need so many layers between her and the general foreman, which creates a really clean, and I'm going to tell you, the people that work for her are they seem happier than some other companies I have looked at.
Cheryl, your thoughts?
Hey, first of all, Bill, work with me, not work for me.
Oh, gotcha.
So, a couple things, I guess, first to address the first question. Yes, this is hard to foster. I was talking to one of our safety people today. He's pretty much part-time. And he suggested to me that maybe 50% of the crews are doing this right now. So 50% is a decent amount for what we're trying to initiate. Steve Martins, who's a little bit of an outside of the box safety man, but he absolutely cares, and people can feel that he really cares about him, and he really has a good idea of safety, and he clicks extremely well with Bill. So the two of them together just kind of create this sort of synergy. Steve Martin's going to be taking time to go out in the field and work with crews for probably a 2-day period per show up. So he's going to continue to reinforce the roles of concerns. Ask them to kind of transition that to the way they want to talk about it, the wording they want to use, how it's going to work for them, so that they can predict it and bring up other points of view. The other thing is the job brief, and I made a suggestion that Steve and Bill both rejected. But the job brief right now is this, from what I've seen of the job brief, is a situation where the working foreman sits in the truck with a clipboard, fills the whole thing out, walks out, says to guys, "Hey, come around here." Maybe talks about it. I'm sure there are probably some crews that they may not even talk about it. They may say, "Sign the job brief." I would like to make the job brief much more interactional in terms of having the working foreman fill out a little bit of it, and then come out of the front of the truck and get everyone in a circle and ask for their opinions. What are the risks? What do you see as the risks and mitigations today? What do you see are tasks? And go around that circle. It's too early for that. We can't change too many things at once, as Bill says. But that would be my next move to progress that safety once we get everybody on board with the roles and concerns portion.
Just like comment on that sounds like a natural transition when you get them engaged and working together. So kind of like the roles and concerns is an additional job brief that's more real because it's based on the work you're about to do. And that's, Cheryl, if I'm not mistaken, you're trying to make it real, right? So it's not just an artificial check the box compliance factor.
So people are actually paying attention and thinking. We really want them to think and connect. That's what we're shooting for. And I think that, I hate to use the word force, but that would kind of force them to do that, which you have to do because they just want to get to work, right?
But then the industry's created that, Kate, that we keep tweaking the job brief, the piece of paper, thinking that's the cause of the incident, and something caused the incident, but it wasn't the job brief or the lack of. Something else usually causes an incident. But we go back, and if every company that's listening to this right now has a different job brief, even though they all have the same crescent wrench and the same chainsaw and the same bucket, they have a different job brief because we keep tweaking the wrong piece. And I think what Cheryl's talking about is when we make it interactive. You're 100% right. I don't know. I don't think I rejected that idea, but
maybe Steve did before he got to you.
Well, I can see it's hard to think of too many things at once, and that could just be being overwhelmed. But I just give you credit. I'm going to do a plug here for the IT conference in Orlando. Actually, Cheryl and Steve are actually speaking to the New York State Public Utility Safety Directors Association on the 9th of May also. And because people are interested in what Cheryl and Steve are doing in that company. And I don't know, having an opportunity to go to your IP conference and actually listen to Cheryl and Steve's story and then ask them questions in person, I just think, I don't think people should miss that.
No, I'm super excited about it. Like, I plan to attend also. No, so I just we've covered a lot of information here this morning, and I just want to offer an opportunity to say anything else that you haven't mentioned that you think is important to mention.
So one thing that one of the main things I'm going to be talking about at the conference in Orlando is that this whole safety model comes from, because it's intangible, it comes from a higher place. And I would never sell it to someone and say that if you have a company where there's lack of respect or mistrust or any of those things, that you can drop this into it and make it work. Because it is hard for our company. And we have, in my opinion, and Steve, I think will support this. We have a lot of engagement. We have trust in our company. Because I don't have layers between myself and the general foreman. There's a lot. It's pretty transparent. So I think that a company really has to start with their culture before they start to move this in. And I think what I'll be talking about at the Orlando conference, just like the roles of concerns model, which is starting something small and then cascading, are 2 small changes you can make in your company to increase the engagement and the trust. And mainly, my word is always respect, because once you start respecting people, they respect you back. And I think in this industry, one thing that I've found is that it doesn't happen overnight, but over time in this company, there's a lot of respect. And that's why I think people like coming to work here and enjoy working here. So that's my message, I guess, is that there's some groundwork to do before you put this in place. And those are things you really have to pay attention to and do the hard work to get that into place.
If you want to shape your culture, there's only 2 things. You have 2 choices. You can do things that release the potential that is in your workforce and in the people around you, or you can suppress it. And if you start paying attention to the language you use and the types of things, Cheryl mentioned respect and trust, right? If you start looking at the language you use and how you interact, that can either release potential or suppress it. And what you want, the companies that do the best have the highest level, that reach the highest levels of their potential. So that seems kind of simple, but when I'll give you an example. If we are in a shame and blame culture and we like to blame a lineman who's been successful all along and now we fire him because he made a mistake, what that does is suppress his potential, because now his loyalty is also gone. Because you will hear this. He will say, and I've heard it, and Cheryl's heard it. Hey, yeah, whatever. I'm only here for my 10 hours and to get paid. Whatever you want. Right? That's because that person is shut down and they're no longer connected to anything except their paycheck. And that's dangerous. And then we wonder how these incidents happen. Almost every time it's because somebody was out of sync, and we missed that person is a disruption to that synchrony because he won't connect. And there's a lot of reasons that happens. So that's just, I'm all in. I want to hear what Cheryl and Steve have to say also.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for your time today. As a reminder to our listeners, Cheryl, Steve, and Bill will be in Orlando on May 22nd at the IP Utility Safety Conference and Expo. And Cheryl's article can also now be accessed in the April-May issue of Incident Prevention, which you can find at incident-prevention.com. Until next time, stay safe and be well.
Let safety shine by joining us for the IP Utility Safety Conference in Orlando, Florida, this May 21st through the 23rd. Register today at utilitysafetyconference.com.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Utility Business Media and its employees. It is strongly recommended that you discuss any actions or policy changes with your company management prior to implementation.